Time, Jack, a novel by John Devine G. Whitfield. Narrated by John Devine G. Whitfield, along with AI voices courtesy of PlayHT. Prelude. Calvin Thompson's sweat-covered face glistened like a melting Hershey's chocolate bar as he barked commands.
Decrease the pitch.
He was dressed in a white lab coat and stood inside a topless control station behind a plexiglass window, watching a machine the size of an overgrown phone booth. 4 other scientists, all similarly dressed, sat behind consoles, adjusting computerized devices connected to the machine. Calvin's anxiety resonated from every part of his body as he nervously rocked back and forth on his heels with his arms crossed.
Take it easy.
He shouted when he heard a surge.
We're not in a race.
The anticipation in the laboratory had almost reached pandemonium. As Calvin looked on while a mixture of frustration, hopelessness, and bewilderment raced through his body, the machine hummed loudly and violently. What was causing the flaw to persist in this manner? Every so often, sparks flew from the base of the machine. Eric Seabright, Calvin's assistant, shuffled over to Calvin and shouted over the noise.
It's not the pitch. We have to increase the energy flow in the distributor. It'll balance out the defects.
Calvin turned and met Eric's excited stare. That was a very risky maneuver. If too much energy was introduced too quickly and a surge took place, the gallium phosphide crystal could explode and not only destroy the machine, but possibly the entire lab. This was the reason Calvin repeatedly discarded this approach whenever the thought crossed his mind. Calvin faced forward and resumed watching the machine as his thoughts ran wild. Could this really be the root of this defect, he wondered? After hastily weighing the situation and the consequences, he decided to take a chance. Eric's suggestion had to be clear confirmation that he was initially on the right track.
Demetrius!
Calvin shouted as he turned to the curly-haired Latino man who had a smooth facial complexion and even features. He sat behind a console resembling a NASA space station.
Slowly increase the energy level in the distributor.
Demetrius's brown eyes widened in shock as he looked up to meet Calvin's no-joking stare. After a moment, his trembling fingers began activating the computer dials. Calvin held his breath. The humming increased and the whole laboratory tremored as if an earthquake had activated. Calvin turned, saw Eric was enthralled with excitement, and for the first time it dawned on him this could be one of Eric's tactics to sabotage the experiment. Eric tried to conceal his desire to gain control of the project, but Calvin's keen ability to read people's ulterior motives was as brilliant as a God-given gift. Suddenly the time machine made an ear-torturous squealing sound, and the smell of burning plastic appeared. The sparks coming from the base of the machine were now flowing steadily. Calvin calculated what the sound and smell represented, and terror bolted through his body. He realized he made a monolithic mistake that would cost him his career. The time machine was going to explode. Just as Calvin frantically spun around, about to scream for Demetrius to decrease the energy, and before he opened his mouth, a sudden, tremendous flash engulfed the lab. Chapter 1. Calvin entered his office as his head spun with fury at what he had done. How was he going to explain this? He flopped down in the seat at his desk and started cursing himself for allowing his overzealousness to cause him to make a decision that brought about this uncomfortable moment of painful mental aerobics. Even though he subconsciously knew his actions were appropriate in light of the greater good that will occur down the road, his heart, on the other hand, seemed to be telling him that his sacrifices might not be worth it. That voice in his head reminded him that he was losing something far greater than success. He didn't want to hear this, so he struck out against the invading thought by opening the project file on his desk, hoping it would help take his mind off the guilt and pain he felt in his chest. The second he laid eyes on the board of directors' statement in response to his progress report, explaining how the energy increase repaired the flaw, he smiled cheerfully. In an instant, he was beginning to feel like his old self again. Then, he repeatedly began telling himself Tamika would understand why he could not attend her first junior high school theater performance, and slowly, he began feeling a little less guilty. If only he hadn't promised her he was going to be there, he could have avoided breaking her little heart once again. The image of Damika's hurt facial expression when she looked out into the audience and saw Ramanda there alone unleashed a pain-stricken grunt. As Calvin struggled to convince himself Damika would understand, he suddenly heard Eric's hard-soled shoes approaching his office. He couldn't understand how those damn shoes could make a tick-tocking sound like no other pair of shoes he had ever heard before. He wondered if Eric had them custom-made with a unique material that made them sound that way. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tock. Calvin sighed, reclined in his seat, and braced himself for the storm that was rapidly approaching. There was no doubt there was going to be some fireworks. Calvin fixed his clean-shaved face, making his ceaselessly serene and friendly expression appear firm and unwavering. His contagious, ready smile mutated into a lockjawed frown that was alien to him and looked as fake as a counterfeit Rembrandt painting. After all these years of mind-wrecking research, and putting up with all the racism at every single stage of his career, there was no way he was going to allow some new jack, rich kid, who was as spoiled as week-old milk sitting in the blazing hot desert sun, to walk in on his project and take everything he worked so hard for right from under his feet. If you kind-heartedly gave an inch, they would ruthlessly take a mile. There was a knock.
Come in.
Calvin shouted. When Eric Seabright entered, Calvin realized he underestimated his response. His boyish facial features and those stone-chiseled cheekbones, encased in a head full of sandy brown hair, didn't look upset in the least. Eric looked so calm. Calvin's thick eyebrows crunched closer to his soft brown eyes with perplexing force. Calvin even felt his dark brown skin turning lighter as the confusion mounted. With a pleasant smile, Eric said,
"We need to talk, Calvin."
He waited for Calvin to offer him a seat, but after a moment breezed by without receiving it, he invited himself. Calvin locked eyes with Eric.
"I'm all ears,"
he said, reminding himself that smiling faces tell lies, and they don't tell the truth.
"I read the board's response to the progress report, and I think it's rather unfair my efforts weren't mentioned."
He was struggling to keep his promise not to blow a gasket.
"What happened?"
"The board writes what it wants in those reports, Eric."
Eric swallowed the built-up rage in his throat as he pulled a copy of the report from the pocket of his lab coat.
"This report says you told them it was you, and you alone, who repaired the glitch in the continuum anti-gravity infusion system."
He politely laid the document on the desk. Calvin sat up and clasped his hands together on top of the desk.
"I don't want to appear as if I'm unconcerned about your grievance, but I am the lead scientist and the time travel expert on this project, and you were brought in to assist me. Yes, you did help, but I discovered the flaw and you—"
"With all due respect, we may still be in the lab trying to rectify the defect. If it wasn't for me—"
Calvin sighed hard.
"You actually believe without you, this problem would not have been detected?"
He shook his head with a smirk on his face, displaying just how pathetic he thought Eric's position was.
"Has it ever dawned on you, if I could create the continuum anti-gravity infusion system, it's apparent I could repair a minor glitch?"
With complete composure, Eric said,
"I heard it was your father who created this system, and it—"
"You should do your homework, Eric."
Calvin rose to his feet, allowing his impatience to take control.
"I'm not going to alter the report. Your contribution was minimal. Any way you choose to look at it, standard protocol says it's well within my right to present my report in this fashion, since you are my subordinate."
Eric humbly locked eyes with Calvin's, but he really wanted to jump up and release some of his frustration. The desire to be the first official time traveler was so piercing, Eric felt a mixture of sheer terror and hatred at the thought Calvin was going to be the one. This was going to be the greatest scientific accomplishment of all times, and Eric was willing to do anything to have his face represent such a phenomenal scientific achievement. He was hoping he could get the board's attention by showing them he was more qualified than Calvin to run the project. But things weren't unfolding as he would like. Although he was recognized as the second most qualified time travel specialist, being number one was the only position he could settle for. What the hell was the board thinking? How could they allow this? Eric told himself if this were a couple of 100 years ago, he wouldn't be sitting here, locked in a staring match with Calvin. He was convinced this work-fanatic, arrogant Negro would be shining his shoes and begging to clean his bathroom. With a humbled smile, Eric rose from the chair and spoke in the most respectful fashion he could muster.
"Thank you for giving me the opportunity to voice my grievance. Now that you mention the protocol, I must admit you're right. I was just hoping our teamwork philosophy would allow each team player to receive credit when he demonstrates he wants what's best for the team. Sorry for the intrusion, Calvin."
When he saw Calvin's head nod, he picked up the report from the desk and exited the office. Calvin flopped down in his chair as a disturbing premonition swept over his entire being. Alarms were going off in the back of his head, each one telling him something was wrong with Eric's nonchalant response to the report. Usually he was excited and hostile about everything. That overconfident smirk and that warped twinkle in his eyes were even more troubling. When the board brought Eric in as his assistant, it only took a couple of days for Calvin to see Eric was an extremely competitive person who had his eyes fixed on taking Calvin's position. It wasn't Eric's desire to become the top man on the project that made Calvin nervous. Since the board wanted the most qualified scientist to be in charge of the project, and because Calvin knew he was the best, Eric was no real threat intellectually. But what got under his skin was Eric's money. It didn't take a lot of brains to recognize money made the world go around, and usually when people with substantial amounts of it went out of their way to obtain things, they usually got what they wanted. Eric had the expression of a man in deep thought as he headed toward Deanna Fulmore, his girlfriend's office. He actually was sizzling with rage. Deanna was talking into her voice-activated computer when Eric entered. She was a brunette with matching colored eyes, and her lustrous, wavy chestnut hair that fell to the middle of her back when she let it all hang out was her most notable feature. With high cheekbones and a waist that was disproportionately small in relation to her thick, muscular-looking legs, Diana could turn plenty young heads, despite being 36 years of age, and could even pass for a model. She stopped in mid-sentence when she saw the tension throbbing from Eric's body.